everyone hear me? If yes, then okay, good. So we're starting with the next panel, which is entitled Imperialisms and Anti-Imperialism. And our first speaker is Dr. Harriet Atkinson, who is a senior lecturer in the history of art and design at the University of Brighton, and currently Arts and Humanities Research Council Leadership Fellow, working on a project about modernist exhibitions in Britain used for propaganda and resistance from 1933 to 1953, which will result, among other things, in a monograph with Manchester University Press, a short documentary film, which sounds very exciting, and a co-edited essay collection entitled Exhibitions Beyond Boundaries, Transnational Exchanges Through Art, Architecture and Design from 1945 to 1985. And that will be published this autumn with Bloomsbury Academic. And Harriet's paper today is entitled Empire with the Lid Off, the Glasgow Workers' Exhibition of 1938.
Thanks so much to Julia and to Marta and to CRAACE for organising this fantastic conference. Crowds thronged Glasgow's Bella Houston Park in 1938 to wander down Dominion Avenue, watch fountains play by day and night, and to look out over the extensive Expo from the Tower of Empire. At the same time, across the city, an exhibition of a rather different type was taking shape. This other exhibition, the Workers' Empire exhibition, was being developed as a counter-exhibition to the much larger and showier Empire exhibition of 1938. This smaller exhibition, created to critique its major counterpart, highlighted the appalling conditions of working people in Glasgow and across the British Empire. In my paper today, I will discuss the people organising this counter-exhibition, both as its subjects and its organisers and those who were its subjects, to consider how it allowed political activists to develop and enunciate their adversarial anti-imperialist agenda. And I should say that as a historian who's usually led by visual material, this has been quite a challenge because the Workers' Empire exhibition is mainly not shown in images. There are very, very few images, and so a lot of the evidence that I'm using, as you'll see, is from textual sources. Between the two world wars, criticism of the British Empire at home was very much a minority discourse outside Black radical circles. As historians Mark Matera and Priyamvada Gopal show, oppositional anti-imperialist voices in Britain only very occasionally percolated through to public and parliamentary debates up until the mid-1930s. Strong anti-colonial sentiment was piqued, however, by the mounting of this exhibition, Britain's last major empire exhibition at Glasgow in 1938. Led by Scottish industrialists, a gallery of the great and the good of Scottish society, with support from Neville Chamberlain and his government to the tune of £11 million, and with the King as patron. So here's a rather chaotic collage of the catalogue pages introducing the luminaries behind the Empire exhibition to show you just how unrepresentative it was: stale, pale, and male. The three women who were part of it were either married to the King or leading the Women's Committee. The Empire exhibition's aims were to showcase Scottish industry, to persuade that the British Empire was making progress at home and overseas, to show off the empire to new generations, to foster trade, and to emphasize empire's peoples as peaceful. In other words, the exhibition was, of course, pro-empire propaganda. The Expo's Architect was Thomas Tate of London practice Burnet, Tate and Lorne. Tate designed its 300-foot tall spectacular viewing tower, the Tower of Empire. This was an extremely ambitious venture for a population recovering from the dire economic slump, with 1.9 million people still unemployed. And with hindsight, we can see it as supremely ill-timed in the context of the ever-worsening political situation and on the eve of the Second World War. But more significantly for my paper today, it was completely misjudged in terms of its representation of empire. The Italian fascist invasion of Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia, of 1935, when Mussolini had occupied one of the few remaining African states not previously grabbed in the 19th century European scramble for Africa, brought into focus the previously unrecognized correlation between European fascism and European colonial endeavors. The major fractures already appearing across the empire were barely hidden within the Glasgow Empire Exhibition's colonial narratives. Displays included the West African colonies, Southern Rhodesia, Victoria Falls and East Africa, Malaya and the West Indies. In the colonial pavilion, a strangely disparate grouping brought together Malta, Somaliland, Hong Kong, and the Falkland Islands. South Africa, already a sovereign independent state by 1938, was inappropriately represented by a pavilion in the form of a Cape Dutch house, a style of rounded gables resonant of the Amsterdam townhouses associated with Dutch colonial settlers. India, nearing independence, refused to participate at Glasgow. There were pavilions for the dominions of New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and Ireland, which by 1938 was believed by most already to have gained independence from the British Empire. For those able to ignore the exhibition's contorted politics of empire, there were abundant pleasures: the impressive tower and buildings, flags fluttering, details picked out at night in bright neon lettering, and first tastes of soft scoop ice cream. A screen advertised glamorous products. The amusement park, designed by Billy Butlins, later the driving force behind a chain of popular British holiday camps, allowed people to fly in Lupo planes and ride on roller coasters through simulated mountain scenery. Formal criticisms were levelled at the exhibition's pavilions. Critic J.M. Richards bemoaned the displays as clumsy and uninspiring and out of line with the gay modernism evident elsewhere. And there was fierce opposition to the exhibition's representation of empire. An editorial in socialist newspaper Forward said, "Anyone who has wandered about the Empire exhibition at Bella Houston would think that the British Empire was a federation of happy and prosperous and contented nations, and that everything in the Imperial Garden was lovely. However," the article continued, "hundreds of millions of natives live under the heel of the exploiter." An article in another socialist newspaper explained that at the Empire exhibition, ideal conditions are being created for enticing your men to become murderous robots on behalf of the ruling caste. While journalist George Padmore, writing in a Pan-Africanist journal, mocked the Empire exhibition for informing their imperial majesties what a glorious contribution to the peace and prosperity of the people of the empire this exhibition represents, even as the working masses of the West Indian island of Jamaica are being shot and bayoneted for demanding betterment of their miserable working conditions. It's clear from all of these accounts that the Empire exhibition's condensed presentation served, in fact, to crystallize colonial opposition, just as it had hoped to do the reverse. Beyond such colonial misrepresentations, conditions for workers at the Glasgow Expo site itself were controversial. Various sources described Expo workers being made to pay the same inflated prices for meals as the visiting public. The casual workers in the amusement park working 16-hour days and attendants working 68-hour weeks. Ironically, the Scottish Trades Union Congress had a small pavilion at the Empire exhibition with a major focus on the need to shorten the working week. The Empire exhibition's vision of Commonwealth cosmopolitanism was predominantly white, and the overt racism of contemporary Britain was conspicuous to the Expo's visitors. A Scottish missionary complained that she and an African colleague had been refused service in the exhibition's most luxurious restaurant, the Atlantic, where the King and Queen had recently been entertained. Many Glasgow hotels also refused non-white guests, something that might have gone unreported had it not been that celebrated Black American bass singer and actor Paul Robeson had struggled to find accommodation during his visit to Glasgow. Spurred on by the mounting grievances against the Expo, counter-action was led by the Independent Labour Party, or ILP, a socialist group already supporting the emergence of dissenting voices and representatives from colonial workers' organisations. ILP opposition was led by activist Arthur Ballard, a carpenter by training whose London Socialist Book Centre was a gathering place for leftist activists. Writing in 1938 in the New Leader, the newspaper of the ILP, Ballard described how, walking amidst the wonderful buildings at the Empire exhibition, one thinks that the Empire is just a paradise on earth. The average visitor amidst this setting may be carried away by this propaganda unless we are able to do something to present the real situation within the Empire. The ILP group, Ballard explained, was planning an anti-imperialist exhibition to present the other side, appealing for funding to support this venture. We hope, he said, to make the exhibition effective not only as propaganda, but as a means of directly helping our comrades in the colonial countries to organise against the exploitation from which they suffer. Any profits would go to develop working class organisations in the colonies. Inspiration for such a counter-exhibition may have come from a number of sources. From the early 1930s, French surrealists were increasingly using counter-exhibitionary tactics to show solidarity with anti-fascist and anti-imperialist causes, as Romy Golan and Adam Joles have shown. Surrealists had responded to the French government's International Colonial Exhibition of 1931, held at Paris's Bois de Vincennes, by organising the counter-exhibition The Truth About the Colonies, intending to speak to French and colonial workers who had not yet developed a revolutionary consciousness. Closer to home, the British Empire exhibition at London's Wembley in 1924 had attracted more than 27 million visitors to witness the empire reproduced in miniature, enabling racist narratives to be reinforced through its so-called native villages and native workshops. Wembley's salacious representations of Africa in London had activated London-based Africans to agitate against the empire. Wembley also motivated public figures who had never previously taken a public stance on British colonialism. Novelist Virginia Woolf wrote Thunder at Wembley after her visit, an essay describing the ominous sky above the exhibition and evoking a force more powerful than empire that would cause it all to tumble down, a kind of imperial apocalypse. In 1938, the counter-exhibition to the Glasgow Empire exhibition, organised by Arthur Ballard, was given the title the Workers' Empire Exhibition and mounted at the Kingston Halls on the Paisley Road in Glasgow. It was designed with a blue and grey colour scheme, purposely echoing that of the Empire exhibition at Bellahouston, with 12 panels grouped around a central column to show that the real owners of the empire are not the people of Britain or of the colonies, but the big financial and commercial interests centred in London. describing the main firms operating within the empire, led by wealthy plutocrats like Lord McGowan and the Duke of Montrose. The exhibition had involved weeks of preparation, much research, and the gathering of material from 3 continents. This research was translated into visual form by a group of London artists contributing voluntarily. Sections were devoted to various parts of the empire, showing how India was being held, quote, in poverty and ignorance by brute force. They gave the background to recent upheavals in the British West Indies, including poor education and population malnutrition, low mining wages in South and East Africa, extermination of native population in Austria, and oppression in Palestine, Ceylon, and Ireland. The form of this fringe event, the Workers' Empire exhibition, allowed for a full-blown counterattack with alternative narratives exposing conspicuous differences of class and race, allowing a developing anti-imperialist political agenda to reach a new audience, and the strong emotion, the collective rage of the exhibitionary attack through which these injustices were highlighted was extremely forceful. This political manifesto in 3 dimensions was accompanied by a plethora of communiques on the same subject produced in other forms. Visitors received a satirical leaflet that adopted the style of a holiday brochure. It invited visitors to come and see the empire by the all-red route, referring to the red route used on maps to demarcate the extent of the British Empire. It mocked, "Visit the empire. It is the duty of every British citizen to see our glorious empire. We must take a proper pride in our possessions, which cover nearly 1/3 of the Earth's surface. Patriotic workers should make use of their holidays to visit the empire." And then citing the costs, as you can see there, as being completely unobtainable for any worker. So this kind of mockery of you know, it being complete, there being a complete sort of lack of equality in terms of who can actually access these places. After introducing the reader to the luxury they would travel in, the pamphlet laid bare the gross inequalities of workers employed on the route, the many aggressions played out in each context, enslaved peoples, shockingly low life expectancies, exposing visitors' lack of knowledge of the realities of their empire. The leaflet highlighted the 2 things that visitors could do to help end the tyranny of British imperialism. The first was to support workers' organisations in the empire fighting for political and economic freedom and justice. The second was to support in Britain the Independent Labour Party, which, they claimed, was the only political party fighting imperialism. The Workers' Empire exhibition was opened by Scottish Labour politician James Carmichael, with celebrated working class novelist and political activist Ethel Mannin pictured here together at the opening. And in fact, this is the only photograph I know of the exhibition's installation, showing the artist's banners behind it. Every other representation is either in the form of an illustration or in textual form. Here's a portrait of Ethel Mannin, who worked with Arthur Ballard on this exhibition, this novelist, photographed here by Paul Tanqueray in 1930. Mannin's opening speech was echoed in her article for socialist newspaper Forward, titled "Empire with the Lid Off," in which she decried the racism of colonialists, British ignorance about the empire, and the imperialist mentality, and noted optimistically the increasing number of people, especially younger people, who were ceasing to take the empire for granted. Mannin pointed out that while the Empire exhibition over at Bella Houston Park was being patronised by royalty, every newspaper was full of news of street fighting in Jamaica, street fighting in Jamaica and the rushing of troops and a battle cruiser to crush the revolt of workers struggling for the privilege of a bare living wage. Just one example, she said, of what could be found on looking below the outward pomp. The two exhibitions were, Manning said, two sides of a medal. The Empire exhibition showed the British Empire from the angle of the owning and the governing classes, the capitalist side of the medal. The Workers' exhibition, she said, showed the empire from the bottom, from the workers' angle. Manning drew out further contrasts. At the Empire exhibition, you could see products of empire, while at the Workers' exhibition, you could see what it has cost in human blood and sweat and exploitation to turn out these products. This exhibition, Manning said, was not spectacular. It did not have clever or expensive floodlighting. It was no amusement park. Indeed, it was, she said, as unspectacular as Hitler's quiet annexation of Austria or Mussolini's quiet extermination of the Abyssinians. Alongside the Workers' exhibition, the new leader ran an 8-page Empire special, amplifying the horrifying conditions in the Empire and the gross inequalities, where socialist activist Fenner Brockway again drew direct parallels between the fascist aggressions of Mussolini and Hitler and those of the imperialists. The Workers' exhibition provided a focal point for a whole series of growing anti-imperialist and anti-fascist voices. And it also provided a physical meeting point for such opposition, accompanied as it was by lectures to packed halls on colonial conditions, given by such prominent speakers as Kenyan anti-colonial activist Jomo Kenyatta and George Padmore, who I've already mentioned, both of whom also published articles fiercely attacking the Glasgow Empire exhibition. Activist groups organised themselves around another fringe event, the Peace and Empire Congress, held at Glasgow's McLennan Galleries in September 1938, where the Scottish Peace Council worked with the International Peace Campaign and the National Peace Council to give delegates from empire countries an opportunity for discussing common peace problems. The Workers' exhibition, although modest, was notable enough to attract messages of congratulation from several prominent socialist leaders, including independence activist Jawaharlal Nehru, who was to become India's first Prime Minister a few years later. A few months later, the exhibition toured from Glasgow to London, showing for 8 days at Friend's House on Euston Road in central London, alongside a colonial conference and public demonstration with speakers from leftist groups, including the Pacifist Peace Pledge Union and speakers from the colonies. All these events provided an invaluable focus for the developing anti-colonial agenda. The new leader reported the outcome of the colonial conference was to appoint a British Centre Against Imperialism and the election of a council of 19 with 10 representatives of the colonial peoples and 9 of British anti-imperialists. Under the heading, Coloured Workers Speak Out, seen here midway down, the new leader noted that the keynote was Karl Marx's declaration that, quote, "Labour with a white skin cannot emancipate itself while labour with a black skin is branded," end of quote. This Marxist quotation was printed on a huge banner backing the platform, showing 2 muscular workers, one white and the other black, linked by the symbol of their work. Following the conference, a committee was appointed to coordinate the struggle against imperialism in the colonies and in Britain, linking the colonial workers' organisations and mobilising support in Britain. So these 2 exhibitions in Glasgow created between them a representation of empire that could be as much kicked against as supported, galvanising individual activists and groups. The Workers' exhibition, a small counter-exhibition, reinforced new anti-imperialist political identities at Britain's end of empire. And it also succeeded in making the Glasgow Empire exhibition explicit proof of all the things that were manifestly wrong with empire. Thank you very much.
We will be switching online now for our first online presentation of today, which is by Dr. Noel Wade, who's a senior lecturer and program manager of the Master of Communication Design in the School of Design at RMIT University at Narm in Melbourne, Australia. He edited the Peter Hoovenier's issue of the RMIT Design Archives Journal in 2021 and contributed with Richard Buchanan a chapter entitled Communicating Design Studies, a Peripheral Dialogue about Transnational Design Pedagogies, to a book titled One and Many Mirrors, Perspectives on Graphic Design Education. He also, one of his recent publications is also Future Fairs, Industrial Exhibitions in New Zealand, 1865 to 1940, which was to the Routledge Companion to Design Studies. And his paper today is titled Speculative Federation, Intercolonial Exhibitions and Republics of Art and Science in Australia and New Zealand from 1878 to 1890.
Thank you. Bon après-midi and bonsoir for myself here in Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands I'm speaking to you today. And I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past and present, and emerging creative practitioners. Now I'm just going to channel a little bit of Otto Neurath at the moment, but the editors of the 2011 Global Design History state in their introduction that comparative methodologies are not widely used in design history, but argue that the juxtaposition and eventual cross-referencing of existing research is one of the areas of great potential for study of both design and design history. This paper examines the role of industrial exhibitions in Australia and New Zealand across a pivotal decade in both countries, when questions of national identity and the possible federation of these antipodean colonies was debated and enacted at various levels. The collaborative and competitive enterprise of industrial exhibitions provided both a stage for conjectures and contestations, and in their co-location, cooperation, and competition revealed the tensions and realizations for the dissolution of a federated Australasia and the differing political and social trajectories of Australia and New Zealand. Australian historian Graham Davison summarised how industrial exhibitions announced the arrival of new members among the Society of Nations, gave a brief epitome of their trade and prospects, and opened the door to closer international relations. He distinguished between the international exhibitions held in Sydney and Melbourne, patterned on London, Paris, Vienna and Philadelphia, and the smaller intercolonial exhibitions held elsewhere in Australia and New Zealand. In her PhD, A Force for Federation, International Exhibitions and the Formation of Australian Ethos, Kirsten Orr documents the progress from colonial to intercolonial exhibitions between 1861 and 1875, when Sydney and Melbourne held a series of colonial exhibitions and one intercolonial exhibition in preparation for the international exhibitions in the period under consideration, concluding these exhibitions between 1879 and 1888 dramatically raised colonial and national consciousness and revealed emerging political aspirations for the secure identity and proper recognition of the Australian colonies on the world stage. While Orr's focus is on the development of a distinctive Australian identity, she identifies the period as a state of flux. In 19th century Australia, the boundaries of national belonging were open to interpretation, and there was a range of possible identities that colonists could adopt. The nation could be viewed as individual colonies, or as Australia, all 6 colonies combined, or as Australasia, encompassing Australia, New Zealand and neighbouring islands in the South Pacific. The international exhibitions significantly contributed to changing perceptions of where the national boundaries should lie, and an increasing tendency to view the nation as the continent of Australia girt by sea. Or also notes that cooperation between colonies was facilitated by networks developed between exhibition commissioners. In terms of Australian and New Zealand relations, this would include serial exhibitionist Richard Tuppenny and Jules Joubert, and New Zealand scientist James Hector and Australian scientist Arthur Liversidge. Joubert and Tuppenny first met at the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1878, and Melbourne's first international exhibition in 1880 provided the meeting place for an entrepreneurial exhibition partnership and the strengthening of an intercolonial and ultimately international networks with New Zealand. Melbourne developed a clear strategy of piggybacking its 5 exhibitions between 1854 and 1872 to provide a collection point for Australian exhibits the year prior to major international exhibitions in Paris, London, Vienna and Philadelphia. This experience of hosting smaller scale colonial and intercolonial exhibitions and participating in international exhibitions prepared them well for hosting their 2 international exhibitions in the 1880s. The fact that Philadelphia was the first held in the New World and commemorated a century since the Declaration of Independence encouraged both Sydney and Melbourne to consider hosting Australia's first international exhibition. As Lynn Spillman has argued, commemoration and international exhibitions encouraged many people to reflect publicly on national identity as well as geopolitical fault lines. Sydney, with a population of 200,000 by 1879, had been a colony for 90 years, and Melbourne, with a population of 280,000 by 1880, commemorated its 50th Jubilee in 1880. However, their respective colonies differed markedly on trade. Victoria maintained a protectionist approach to developing local industry through tariffs and sought an exhibition to draw attention to the modernity of Australian production, while New South Wales advocated for free trade and wanted exposure to foreign innovation. Both cities were also competing to be viewed as the major international metropolis. Robert Freestone argued that the twin exhibitions reflected a muscling for comparative advantage and were exercises in place marketing before the term was invented, while Shirley Fitzgerald simply suggested that the main reason Sydney proposed an international exhibition was because Melbourne had. Whatever their reasons, both cities declared their intentions in Paris and used the international venue to lobby for support, and the appeal of double exposure for European exporters proved to be an attractive one. The differing experience in hosting exhibitions certainly affected the way in which each city prepared for the first international exhibition. In Sydney, the initial proposal was put forward in 1877 by the entrepreneurial secretary of the New South Wales Agricultural Society, Jules Joubert. Conceived of as a private initiative and an extension of existing agricultural fairs to promote international trade, it was poorly planned and the promoters clearly underestimated international commercial interest. The exhibition committee was formed less than a year before opening and was almost cancelled as the necessity of a new purpose-built building to accommodate international demand became evident. Governor Sir Hercule Robinson encouraged the incoming Parks government to give official support, suggesting the exhibition could unite the colonies as a preliminary step towards federation. In January 1878, the Government of New South Wales gave official support and guaranteed £50,000 in financial support, a figure that proved to be merely a fifth of the final cost of the exhibition. Colonial architect, meanwhile, James Barnett, had hurriedly drawn up plans for the Garden Palace only 1 month previously and without a site finalised. Constructed of timber with rendered brick to look like stone, it had all the makings of an ephemeral vista. Numerous ad hoc changes were made in conjunction with the builders to extend exhibition space right up to the opening of September 1879, with the buildings finally covering 15 acres. Over 1 million people attended the exhibition over its 6-month duration, and it certainly achieved one of its goals, being subsequently described as the first general exposure of Australians to the current state of world technology, especially manufacturing technology. Its 3 major impacts were the formation of new cultural institutions, the Technological Museum, Permanent Art Gallery and Sydney Technical College, the development of a metropolitan tram system, and a stimulus for further urban development. It was also the first appearance of Lucien Henry, who received an honorary mention in the non-European sculpture class, which speculated on the federation of the then 5 Australian colonies. Jules Joubert had previously been the secretary of the 1870 Sydney Intercolonial Exhibition, and in 1874 sought united colonial representation at the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition before pressing New South Wales claims at the expense of Victoria. As secretary of the New South Wales Commission, he organised the exhibits for the Paris exhibition, as well as arranging French participation in the 1879 Sydney exhibition. However, on his return, he found himself excluded from the commission for the Sydney exhibition he had conceived and organised. Nevertheless, he had met in Paris the South Australian secretary, Richard Tuppenny, who remained in this position for the 1879 Sydney and 1880 Melbourne International Exhibitions. The pair sought instead to extend the intercolonial network by means of purely commercial exhibitions, where income was derived from ticket sales, advertisements and rents, as well as limiting salaries and limiting the size of committees. As Peter Hoffenberg noted, as a business, exhibitions required the organisational techniques and expertise found in other large-scale Victorian-era collective projects, such as manufacturing or the state. The first exhibition in Adelaide ran July to September 1881, followed by Perth in November, January, and finally across the Tasman Sea to Christchurch in March to May of 1882. Adelaide was a financial success and attracted over 276,000 paying visitors, while Perth only attracted 22,000, although the city's population was less than half of that number. While Christchurch attracted 226,000 visitors, it only made a small profit after the sale of all buildings. However, the process remained the same: to draw upon a network of intercolonial manufacturers and international exhibitors from previous exhibitions as a fair tour through the regions of Australasia, occupy vacant inner city land and erect temporary warehouses which were then deconstructed and sold at the conclusion of the exhibition. This entrepreneurial speculation also offered projective, experiential, participatory and leisurely vistas of what a city might be, as well as what civic infrastructure and services needed to be improved. They also extended an open invitation to visit as a tourist or to migrate to meet these needs. These exhibitions also planted the seed for the further production of a large-scale civic and international exhibitions in Adelaide in 1887 and Christchurch in 1908. In the case of Perth, the reclaimed land on which the exhibition was built became a public park, and the city took Jules Joubert's parting suggestion to build the city baths on the foreshore in 1885 before exhibiting a Western Australian court at the Colonial and Indian Exhibition in London in 1886. This intercolonial staging post enabled Jules Joubert to become the Executive Commissioner of the Calcutta International Exhibition in 1882, building on his enthusiasm for Australian Indian trade and the role of exhibitions in forging and maintaining such links. As Bandopadhyay argued, the exhibition Walla, Joubert was genuinely interested in opening a space for cultural exchange between Australia and India. Meanwhile, Tuppenny published 2 books, Town Life in Australia from Sydney and a proposal for holding an Australasian exhibition in London in 1883. The latter, according to Davison, expressed his conviction that the Australian colonies, both as a source of imports and field of colonisation, had neglected to press their claims upon an apathetic English public. The scheme was a further stepping stone in Tuppenny's career as a cultural broker between the colonies and the mother country. Tuppenny and Joubert resumed their twinned roles at the 1888 Melbourne International Exhibition, with Joubert triumphantly returning to represent New South Wales, while Tuppenny, who had become the editor of the Otago Daily Times in Dunedin after the Christchurch exhibition, was the New Zealand Commissioner. Meanwhile, in Sydney, Lucien Henry used the commemorative centennial to cast a set of medallions for the Speculative Federation of Oceania, which included New Zealand, but not Western Australia. These were incorporated into the lift of Anthony Horden's Palace Emporium in Sydney. At the conclusion of the Melbourne exhibition, Joubert and Chekini returned to New Zealand for the 1888-90 New Zealand and South Seas exhibition, where Chekini was the executive commissioner and Joubert the manager, and they were able to draw from exhibitors from Adelaide and Melbourne. Davison concluded that the New Zealand and South Seas exhibition of 1889 was a triumphant culmination of Chekini's career as an exhibition promoter, attracting over 600,000 paying visitors and making a profit. And the reclaimed land that the exhibition occupied soon filled permanently with the warehouses of industrial producers and importers the exhibition sought to promote. Jules Joubert returned to Tasmania to organise his two final exhibitions in Launceston in 1891 and Hobart in 1894. As I argued in the Rutledge Companion to Design Studies, the Dunedin exhibition was also a turning point in New Zealand's representation at such exhibitions, moving from its first 1865 vision of a southern factory of furnaces and coal pits to a more sustainable scenic wonderland for tourists, which informed the development of the Department of Tourist and Health Resorts in 1901. Its inclusion of the early history Māori and South Seas courts also acknowledged a distinctive Indigenous culture and a national consciousness. It also signalled a reorientation to the Pacific, or Oceania as Lucien Henry framed it, and a shift away from the federating intercolonial movement which had gathered force in Australia at the 1888 Melbourne exhibition. Alongside the entrepreneurs of industrial exhibitions was the facilitating and ultimately federating enterprise of two scientists, Archibald Liversidge and James Hector. James Hector was appointed director of the Geological Survey of Otago, New Zealand in 1861 and organised displays of his maps and collections of the first New Zealand exhibition in Dunedin in 1865. He was then appointed director of the Geological Survey and Colonial Museum in Wellington, establishing the New Zealand Institute in 1867 to encourage the spread of scientific knowledge. Archibald Liversidge was appointed to the readership of geology at the University of Sydney in 1872, producing his geological maps of Australia and Tasmania in 1875. Both attended the Philadelphia exhibition in 1876, Liversidge representing Victoria and New South Wales and Hector as Commissioner for New Zealand. They then proceeded together to the meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Buffalo, which, along with French and English associations, was to be a model for their intercolonial and international activities. Liversidge then attended the 1878 Paris exhibition as New South Wales Commissioner, as well as the International Congress of Geologists, and carried out a report on technical education in Britain and Europe. He returned convinced of the importance of international exhibitions and established the Technological Museum in Sydney. Hector and Liversidge both attended the 1879 Sydney exhibition as honorary committee members alongside the Intercolonial Meteorological Conference before returning to Melbourne as commissioners for their respective colonies of New Zealand and New South Wales in 1880. Liversidge repeated his role in Amsterdam in 1883 and Hector in Melbourne in 1888. In the Commonwealth of Science, Scientific Enterprise in Australasia, Roy McLeod explained how scientists shared experience and circulated information on transcolonial issues such as astronomy, meteorology, mineralogy, geography, and geology, and Liversidge in particular actively promoted the exhibition movement. Quote, "They even sensed the need for an intercolonial program, a system of free trade and ideas of intellectual cooperation that did not compromise colonial loyalties to the city-states of Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or Christchurch." In 1881, government astronomers of New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia met with James Hector to press Queensland to join in collecting standardised data. They effectively became an intercolonial movement in themselves. In 1884, Liversidge wrote to the Sydney Morning Herald suggesting a federation of the members of the various scientific societies in Australia, Tasmania and New Zealand for Sydney as part of the 1888 centennial celebrations. As part of his president's address in 1886, he announced an Australasian collaboration and agreed on a congress in Sydney in September 88, with Hector as vice president of the Federated Australasian Association for the Advancement of Sciences, comprising the 6 Australian colonies and New Zealand. It was the first such association of its kind. It was the 5th such association of its kind in the world and was attended by 850 delegates. At the 3rd Congress in 1891, Sir James Hector concluded in his presidential address that science had provided, quote, the first truly effective step towards federation which has yet been achieved, and I trust that all our workers will continue to be imbued with this spirit. This triumph of the intercolonial principle was in sharp contrast to the official speeches of the governors of New South Wales and Victoria at the foundation stone ceremonies of the rival exhibition buildings in 1879 and 1880, which according to Fitzgerald stressed ideas of cooperation and intercolonial federation, but rivalry was the dominant sentiment due to their respective protectionist and free trade policies. However, at the conclusion of the Dunedin exhibition in 1880, local MP Thomas Hislop concluded, the foundations have been laid for a better knowledge between the colonies and to see their mutual interdependence. We have thus, I think, gone far to lay the foundation for a future political alliance, which I, for my part, hope will yet to be carried out. New Zealand attended the first political federation convention the following year, 1891, in Melbourne, due to its status as an original state prior to 1840. As New Zealand historian Philippa Mines-Smith has pointed out, New Zealand's aspirations for Pacific Federation and preferential free trade with the United States irritated both Britain and the Australian colonies, and New Zealand manufacturers opposed federation, fearing it would give rise to a protectional federal tariff akin to Victoria's. New Zealand did not attend the Second Federation Convention in 1897, and Mines-Smith concluded, Australian federation was already having the effect of consolidating national identity on both sides of the Tasman. But it could also be said that scientific federation of Liversidge and Hector notwithstanding, the intercolonial exhibition movement in New Zealand, facilitated by Joubert and Tuppenny, also played a significant part. As something of a post-national coda, it is worth noting that the Australian flag, which resulted from a competition of 30,000 designs in 1900, was selected as it was submitted by the 5 winners, representing 3 of the federated states, Victoria, New South Wales and Western Australia, as well as 1 New Zealand entrant. The judges added, should it ever happen that the people of New Zealand change their minds and decide to enter the Union, it will only be necessary to place a 7-pointed star instead of a 6-pointed one beneath the Union Jack. Finally, as a design historian, it would be remiss of me not to mention the intercolonial designers and educators. David Con Hutton won a prize at the 1880 Melbourne exhibition for his design drawing book, and Lucien Henry and Arthur Riley both taught together at the Sydney Mechanics School of Art before Riley established the second design school in New Zealand in Wellington in 1886. Riley, like Henry, was an advocate for an Indigenous approach to design and a champion of technical education. Lastly, Edmund Anscombe, who attended both the Melbourne and Dunedin exhibitions in 1888 and 1889 as a teenager, trained as an architect in America and worked upon the construction of the St. Louis World Fair before returning to New Zealand to design the last 2 New Zealand exhibitions in Dunedin 1925 and Wellington 1940. His motto, like Joubert and Tuppenny, was, make no little plans.
So our final speaker for this panel is Dr. Laura Mure Chekini. whose research focuses on the transnational legacies of fascist visual and material culture. Her recent book, Baroque Mania, which appeared with Manchester University Press this year, studies the cultural politics of the Baroque in the construction of modern Italian visual culture. She's now at work on two projects, one analyzing artistic exchanges between Italy and Argentina in the context of transatlantic fascist diplomacy, and the other on the material debris of Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. And her paper today is entitled Young Races Love Tents, the exhibition of colonial equipment at the 1940 Milan Triennale.
In 1935, 23-year-old journalist Indro Montanelli, filled with patriotic excitement, volunteered in the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, a 5-year occupation marked by war crimes and genocidal practices. Yet recalling this experience in his memoir, Montanelli described it as such, and I quote, "This war was for us like a nice long vacation gifted by Big Daddy Mussolini as a reward for 13 years of mandatory school. I had 2 years of beautiful life outdoors, a life of adventure in which I felt like a Rudyard Kipling character," end quote. Upholding such idea of violent colonial warfare as a vacation and adventure, in 1940, an exhibition of colonial equipment opened in Milan's Triennale. The Mostra dell'Attrezzatura Coloniale showed portable but well-designed furniture and objects meant to, in the words of its organizer, Carlo Enrico Rava, provide Italian officers and bureaucrats, and I quote, "the maximum of stability and comfort in their new nomadic life in caravans, tents, and professional barracks," end quote. For Rava, and I quote again, "The Ethiopian enterprise offers enormous possibilities to an adventurous spirit, a felicitous feature of the conquest of an empire and its improvement," end quote. Today, I will examine the Mostra addressing the tension between its political aim, encouraging settler colonization in Ethiopia, and its actual discourse, extolling a life in the move. Was Ethiopia a pacified colony where Italian middle-class families could settle? Or was it a contested territory where Italian officials, bureaucrats, and scientists constantly decamped, crushing an ongoing resistance, and where only desperate Italian peasants would voluntarily move? This conference aspires to, and I quote, "look beyond Universal Exhibition's official state-sponsored aims, placing agency at the heart of the discussion. By focusing on the Mostra's organizer, architect, set designer, and interior decorator, Carlo Enrico Rava, I aim to unpack the tensions in fascist propaganda of the Ethiopian invasion, one of the most gruesome colonial endeavors promoted to middle-class Italian audiences as nothing more than a safari or adventure." As an international exhibition, the Milan Triennale picked up in 1933 for its 5th edition, when it was formally recognized by the Bureau International des Expositions and moved to its current building. In the 1936 Triennale, opening after Ethiopia's invasion, Eduardo Persico's Salon of Victory, which you can see here on your right, offered a blueprint for the synergic relation between Italian modernism and the colonial enterprise, a relation shaping Rava's architectural and curatorial practices too. The last Triennale before World War II opened in 1940. Its brief was order and tradition. This Triennale lasted only 2 months, from April 6th to June 9th. On June 10th, Italy entered the war. When ascending the majestic staircase in the Palazzo dell'Arte, visitors would encounter a mural titled "Fascist Civilization," celebrating the regime's intervention in Italy's colonies. Yet among the various displays of the Triennale, the only one explicitly dealing with colonialism was the Mostra dell'Attrezzatura Coloniale, which occupied 3 small rooms in the 2nd floor. Rava pointed out that no folkloristic or vague exoticism would inform the Mostra. His ambition was also seemingly different from that of other modernist colonial design projects. Rather than decor for Italian settlers' houses in Asmara or Addis Ababa, such as the ones you can see here, Rava showed furniture and objects destined for Italian peripatetic functionaries. Yet, as I will show, the same class interest informed both. They catered to the Italian bourgeoisie, albeit these projects its desire for familiar comfort, and Rava its desire for thrilling adventure. Portable furniture was in view in the mostra, recreating the experience of living on the move in Ethiopia for the benefit of Triennale audiences. This furniture was demountable, made of lightweight woods or plastic, and materials like canvas and linoleum. After Ethiopia's invasion, the Society of Nations imposed economic sanctions that curtailed Italy's industrial production, so local materials were privileged in the exhibition. Colonial equipment had to suit African climate, but also convey Italian superiority vis-a-vis Ethiopians. And I wanted to play this video. Let's see if it loads up. The objects on view were, in Rava's eyes, propaganda highlighting the difference between Italian settlers and the colonized. No, it doesn't run, sorry. Maybe eventually. The mostra thus included objects destined to elevate Italian temporary quarters, such as carpets, dishes, coffee pots, and cigarette cases. As Rava wrote, and I quote, "Such decorum is indispensable for the maintenance of the complex set of hierarchies at the basis of colonial life, as well as to maintain in the face of natives the privileges and racial prestige of a dominating people." Rava wanted to highlight that Italian officials were nomads in brief, but not in the same way as Ethiopians were. And for proof, I had here a nice Italian fascist newsreel representing so-called Ethiopian nomads, and you could have compared it with Italian nomadism that the mostra celebrated. Maybe later. As the expert movie set designer he was, Rava carefully choreographed the mostra's 3 rooms. Firstly, visitors encountered a patio, a brick wall, evoking African adobe architecture, and on the back wall was a mural by painter Felicita Frei Luste. Despite Rava's explicit brief to avoid exoticizing imagery, this mural obviously reiterates Orientalist fantasies. Rava just could not resist conjuring the feeling of lounging in an unspecified exotic country in the company of sexually available women. After all, a cliché that his visitors were familiar with and attracted by. Armchairs and deck chairs in this first display evoke relaxation and calm, eclipsing the violent reality of Ethiopia's colonial occupation. The second room showed portable radios and telephones and cases for guns, which Rava described as equipment for travel, hunting, and caravan, obscuring their primary function as war weapons. Rava designed a floating showcase with a bamboo back wall, evoking further the impression of being in a hunting expedition rather than in a colonial war. The right side of the room recreated even more temporary spaces than the ones on view in the first one, in a crescendo from stability and female-coded spaces such as harems and patios to increase mobility and male-coded activities such as hunting. On view was more furniture designed for mobile life, camp beds, portable chairs, and lightweight tables. The first 2 rooms of the Mostra dell'Attrezzatura prepared viewers for the most dramatic space. At the center was a display table resembling a sailboat, adding to the sense of adventure conjured throughout the mostra. Floating panels publicizing the firms in the exhibition, such as Ditta Ettore Moretti, with which Rava collaborated, adapting their chairs, camping cots, and portable canteens to suit the needs of colonial functionaries. These objects were on view nearby in the most theatrical space in the exhibition. Closed off by blinds, this veranda made visitors feel far away from Milan. Plants and a sun-covered ground alluded to the tropical environment that audience members associated with Africa. A lounge chair and a side table with glasses and a jar full of a refreshing liquid invited visitors to perform the life of an Italian peripatetic official. His existence, it was implied, was unstable but not dangerous, rather adventurous, exciting, intrepid. The veranda closed the exhibition and the vicarious experience of living, albeit for the brief span of a visit, like colonial officials, geographers, and bureaucrats lived in Ethiopia. Such experience, Rava pointed out, was not as foreign as it seemed. The furniture on view, he wrote, could also give good ideas to those who live in the countryside or love traveling. Rava familiarized an alien experience, inviting the bourgeois visitors of the Triennale to participate in Italy's imperial project. So who was Carlo Enrico Rava, and what was his agenda in portraying life in the Italian colonies as a form of safari, as a hunting adventure? Rava trained in Milan as an architect, and in 1926, together with other 6 young architects, he founded the Gruppo Sette, the first presentation of razionalismo, Italy's form of architectural modernism. Yet soon Rava felt ambivalent about rationalism's international resonance and rather became interested in devising an Italian modern colonial architecture. Rava traveled to Africa at least 4 times between 1927 and 1931. This was because his father, Maurizio Rava, was a high colonial administrator in Libya and governor of Somalia from 1931 to 1935. A Jewish photographer and painter, Maurizio Rava fought as a volunteer in Italy's colonial wars and participated in geographic expeditions in Africa. Carlo Enrico first traveled to the continent in 1927 when he visited Libya, an Italian colony since 1911. Studying North African vernacular architecture, Rava concluded that its whitewashed buildings and rational adaptation to climate and function clearly revealed the imprint of ancient Rome. Rationalism, in brief, was not a modernist international invention. It was the legacy of a specifically Roman, and thus Italian, culture in the Mediterranean. For Rava, an Italian colonial architecture directly inspired in the rationalism of the Mediterranean vernacular tradition reinforced the legitimacy of fascist imperialism. Rava returned to Libya in 1929, traveling through the Sahara to the Berber town of Gadames, recently occupied by Italians and becoming a prominent tourist destination. Gadames' buildings were for Rava further proof that Libya was fundamentally Roman, and thus that it culturally and politically belonged to Italy. When his father became governor of Somalia, Rava traveled to Equatorial Africa. During this trip, which he recorded in the huge photo album that you can see here, Rava participated in an elephant safari on the Juba River. His album shows his own experience of life in the move, using some of the equipment that he exhibited in the 1940 Triennale. Mia Fuller has highlighted the sharp differences between Italian architectural discourse in Libya and in Ethiopia, and Rava's career is further proof of her argument. When discussing colonial architecture in Libya, Rava underscored the Roman roots of indigenous traditions, justifying the occupation as a return to lands formerly Roman and therefore Italian. Rava's discourse on Mediterranean colonial architecture was not addressed at Libyans themselves, of course, but rather at French and English colonial architects who were grappling with similar problems. Once Ethiopia was invaded, however, Italian architects' main concern was to use the built environment to regulate and control relations between colonizers and colonized. Yet in addition to racial difference, Rava also insisted that colonial architecture in Ethiopia should enforce class differences, arguing that, and I quote, "It is of the utmost importance that architects who build in Ethiopia belong to that deprecated class called bourgeois," end quote. Rava's engagement with Attrezzatura Coloniale and his 1940 Mostra reveals such class politics, setting him apart from the official Italian colonial discourse. One of Rava's first engagements with colonial equipment was as a curator of the Pavilion of Italian Africa at Rome's Exhibition of Minerals in 1938. Rava designed a daring display using enlarged photographs of African landscapes, reproductions of ancient Ethiopian maps, religious objects, and mineral samples. Addressing mining professionals, Rava exhibited a Ditta Moretti tent and some of the foldable chairs and tables that he would include at the 1940 Triennale too. But unlike the latter, in the 1938 exhibition, colonial equipment was at the service of practicality rather than prestige. The 1938 exhibition sparked in Rava sustained reflection on how already existing camping gear and portable furniture could be adapted to life in Ethiopia, so as to serve not just as an immediately practical purpose, but also an ideological one. In a series of articles he published in the iconic modernist design magazine Domus between 1939 and 1941, Rava outlined a veritable theory of Kipling-esque bourgeois living in the colonies. Two were the main threads of Rava's discourse. Firstly, that far from being a mere accessory, colonial equipment was, and I quote, the supreme expression and most beautiful affirmation of a truly imperial concept, end quote. Secondly, that it allowed a nomadic, adventurous existence that was, as Rava repeated again and again, the main features of colonial life in Ethiopia, a discourse that actually clashed with official propaganda surrounding fascist imperialism in Africa. Indeed, since the late 19th century, colonialism was promoted in Italy as a necessary release to its demographic crisis, an alternative to emigration to the Americas. Somalia, Eritrea, Libya, and briefly Ethiopia were presented as ideal destinations for peasant families struggling to make do in Italy's impoverished countryside. In the interwar period especially, once the United States limited European immigration, it was necessary to find new outlets for Italy's surplus labor. Despite the massive propagandistic effort that the fascist state spent in this regard, Italy was not Italian emigrants' favorite destination. Single males made up the majority of the Italian population in the colonies until the 1930s, setting up home with African women. After 1936, and even more after the passing of the 1938 anti-Semitic racial laws, fascism could not tolerate these. Thus, it encouraged the migration of entire peasant families, promoting a demographic colonization of Ethiopia's rural areas. Yet the majority of the Italians who emigrated to Ethiopia in the 5 years of the Italian occupation settled in cities, where the regime created infrastructures and promoted commercial activities that gave to Addis Ababa and Gondar a distinctively Italian feel. Does Rava's Kipling-style discourse of the adventurousness of colonial life run against the grain of official fascist propaganda in more ways than one? Firstly, because it was, in his reference to harems and camping gear, very much coded male, while the regime intended to promote an idea of Ethiopia as a destination for families. Secondly, because it was coded as bourgeois, while fascism presented itself as transcending class differences and actively promoted the migration of the working class, knowing well that encouraging upper-class Italians to move to Ethiopia was a losing proposition. Despite not totally lining up with the official fascist colonial rhetoric, Rava's colonial war as adventure had great traction in interwar Italy, informing advertisements such as the ones you see on the screen here, board games, and other forms of propaganda. Rudyard Kipling and other British and French colonialist fiction had been translated into Italian since the early 1900s, while the interwar period saw the thriving popularity of Emilio Salgari reframed as pre-fascist and pro-colonialist. Rava's Mostra dell'Attrezzatura, in brief, partakes of a wider discourse on colonialism that, despite not fully matching with fascist propaganda, was extremely popular and shared key elements of the fascist cult of youth, action, and violence. It was also a discourse that thrived, as Rava knew well, precisely among the Italian entrepreneurial bourgeoisie, who was economically invested in Ethiopia's invasion and the production of equipment making it possible. The title of my talk, indeed, is a direct quotation from a 1939 volume celebrating the 20th anniversary of Milan's trade fair, with the quite formidable title of Productive Forces of the Avant-Garde. A pen to the Moretti camping company that Rava collaborated with, the article extolled the tent-like mentality to foster a colonialist mindset, and I quote, "Adventures happen to silent, simple tent dwellers. So great historical adventures always happen to young races who love tents, who pitch tents throughout the world, who are familiar with tents and feel at home in them. Young races do not accept the mediocre life that destiny and history have assigned them. They conquer the world with their tents. Today, Italy has some of the best tents in the world, the Moretti tent. Italy needs tents for soldiers, for colonial officials, for scientists searching mines and raw materials in Ethiopia, for cartographers, for pioneers, for explorers. Italy is a young country marching behind its tents," end quote. In spring 1941, British troops occupied Italy's colonies in Africa. Ethiopia's occupation had lasted exactly 5 years. As his father was Jewish, During World War II, Rava was forced to go into hiding. In the post-war period, he was accused of having profited from his father's political appointments to gain state commissions and was banned from the architectural profession. He destroyed most of his personal archive, making it hard to reconstruct his own views under fascism. Yet with the material that we do have, we can see how crucial his Mostra dell'Attrezzatura is in revealing a colonial discourse that did not fully align with official propaganda and yet helped make Italy's imperialist policies palatable to the bourgeoisie. Rava's 1940 show also reveals the complicity of industrialists, designers, and architects with colonial propaganda and the class and race politics that inform Italian interwar modernist design. To conclude, the brief of this colloquium is to examine exhibitions through the lens of the human factor, but there is someone in the Mostra dell'Attrezzatura who we have not taken at all into consideration, because it is completely obliterated in Rava's and more broadly, the Kipling-esque colonialism as adventure discourse. I'm speaking of Ethiopians, of course, who are totally invisible in the Mostra, but who, when Italy invaded their country, predicted only for 5 years only would the occupation last. And they were right. Thank you.
Are there any questions from the audience?
This was a lovely panel. Thanks so much. Harriet, did I miss it, but who organized this counter exhibition? Was it the Labour Party? Was it the Communists?
It was the Independent Labour Party. And the leader was Arthur Ballard. He was a sort of young activist who he was trained as a carpenter and then became very politically engaged and active. And he ran a socialist book shop in London and was also do I need to? No. And he became very activated by the 1938 Empire Exhibition and then drew various people in. So it was very interesting that the number of small organizations that he called upon to, you know, leftist organizations, socialist, peace organizations, lots of small emerging organizations that were all kind of brought together by him.
And was there a Communist Party in Scotland, or did it resort under the Great Britain Party?
It was Great Britain. There would have been branches locally, but the Communist Party isn't, and actually lots of people were of course affiliated across organizations, but the Communist Party itself isn't. The ILP was very left, on the left, so probably they were also, there were members of both, but the Communist Party wasn't a moving force, although it's likely that well, Ethel Manning was definitely a Communist Party member, for example. So I think there was you know, exchange between them, but they certainly weren't the kind of leading force.
Thank you. Just as a point of interest, in 1936 in Johannesburg Empire Exhibition, there was also resistance from the Communist Party, not just against the Empire Exhibition in Joburg, but also the invasion in Italy, created in Ethiopia, created a lot of excitement under South African Black people, seeing once independent nation take up arms and be able to fight was very inspirational. And the newspaper called Imsebenzi, the Worker, carried a lot of footage and interesting cartoons on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the interesting panel and for the great talks. I have two questions. My first one is to Harriet, the second one to Laura. In your presentation, you told us a lot about counter exhibitions and the maybe unwritten history of counter exhibitions in the 1930s, because from my research, I know 1936, after the Berlin Olympic Games, there was a counter exhibition in Amsterdam attacking the kind of bodies on display in Berlin and all these. Well, I don't need to elaborate further, but what would you say is the, I guess, impact of counter exhibitions? Because I guess they are fairly straightforward, put together quickly, just to have an impact on the newspapers, maybe on the news cycle even, and then, well, they are gone. So maybe that could be elaborated and tell us a little bit more about that kind of character of counter exhibitions. And for Laura, it's the same question always for Italian modernism, because it's so, I guess, contradictory and ambivalent as well, because you told us a lot about nomadism, safaris, hunting, which sounds in line with the language of modernism, whereas it just, you know, it covers up the evil nature of the whole mission. But yeah, the usual question for Italian modernism is, how was modernism incorporated with fascism, and what were the contradictories, but also the, well, things meshing well and things combining well within that framework for colonialism? Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that question. What's the impact? I mean, that's always the $100 million question for all of us who write about exhibitions, I suppose, because it's so dispersed, it's so hard to trace, it's so hard to know in what forms one is looking for the impact. I mean, I think what we have in this moment is the thing that I'm really interested in fact is these exhibitions as information and as communication. And as a form of communications media, this counter exhibition sits alongside a whole plethora of other forms that are also being evolved in that moment. So exhibitions become this kind of three-dimensional hybrid, spatial, visual, textual kind of mouthpiece for a whole set of ideas that are also being developed across fiction and news and film and in lecture series and in conferences. And so what I tried to show at the end of my paper is, you know, you have, this is a fringe event, and then there are fringe events to this fringe event as well. And so in a way, what it does is it sort of starts to galvanize and to bring together a whole series of voices, oppositional voices, that then are then activated, I think, by that kind of coming together, either in print form or some other form, or in real spaces. So it's interesting reading someone like Primavada Gopal's book about insurgent empire. And so counter exhibitions in the British context, sometimes they're just referred to. There was an exhibition here, there's no further information about it, what it was, but they're like a footnote often. But they were happening quite often because I guess exhibitions were a form of public communication that were often sort of under the radar. So I think the impact is hard to judge, but I think it becomes part of the movement.
Could I jump off of that question to ask you a question? Do you think it is the lack of visual material that you mentioned in the introduction is part of these discourse? The fact that so much of the visual material that we have for official exhibitions is because there was a long-term planning group of photographers who were assigned that particular task. Well, for counter exhibitions, there's just not that time or that economic investment. Do you think that's the case?
I think this is what's interesting, because often we equate historical importance with kind of evidence and visual evidence, or evidence of other kinds. And I think the thing that I'm grappling with in my current project, which is about a lot of different exhibitions that were politically engaged, lots of them, there's nothing about them. You know, someone says in their biography, oh, I went to this exhibition and it made me really excited about this particular issue. And then you're like, where is this material? But so I think it is, yeah, it's the lack of visual material, because they didn't make the kind of glossy magazines and the big mainstream newspapers, makes it hard to in a way judge the importance and the impact. I don't know quite if that's what you were asking, but yeah.
And to try to answer your question. So how fascism incorporated modernism. So I'll try to answer in two parts. The first part is very well, thank you very much. It's like, that's just what makes it so interesting to study fascist modernism. It's just that these two things that are sort of, I would say, post-war, MoMA, Alfred Barrett's kind of discourse has primed us to think are complete opposite, that there's no way modernism could thrive under a totalitarian regime. Italy is exactly the counter example to that. It thrived very well. Actually, there is no modernist critique to fascism in Italy at the time. It's true that some modernist architects ended up working in the resistance, but that's after the official end of fascism. It's one of fascism's brightest ideas to incorporate the avant-garde and modernism to sort of prevent any sort of modernist critique of itself. It's one of the key elements of fascism is these multiple ideology that can have something for everyone, including the modernists, the avant-garde, youth, revolution, etc. So fascism is in a certain way the bad consciousness of modernism. The second part of my answer is linked to this particular exhibition, which is in the very few bibliography that exists on the Mostra dell'Attrezzatura Coloniale, it is framed as the ancestor of post-war sort of pre-IKEA production of portable, cheap furniture. So after the end of the war, when many people had their houses destroyed, there was a need in Italy to produce furniture with local materials that was mountable, done with plastic or cheap wood, and local materials like linoleum or canvas. So this exhibition is in a certain way the prototype for that kind of pre-IKEA sort of production. So I think it's very interesting to see how something that we associate with, again, democratic liberal values such as furniture for everyone, portable, build it yourself, actually has its origins in a project that is very much tied with colonialism and with imperialism. I don't know if I answered your question.
I think there's one question from Sam Albert, and I just also, because he's not visible, I wanted to remind you that we have a third speaker as well, Noel. Okay, he's here, just very small.
Unlike Christian, I have a question for Laura and Harriet. There is a great deal of work that's been done on German imperial portable furniture, which is taking place before the First World War. And I'm wondering if the Italian architects and designers were aware of that and influenced by it, because it's exactly the same kinds of questions. You know, we need to design appropriate German houses for an African clime. We need to design appropriate German houses for a Pacific clime. I'm wondering about that. And as to Harriet, was there a counter exhibition to Wembley? Because it seems to me that's nothing against Scotland. The Scottish exhibition seems sort of small. Wembley is the big, oh, isn't the empire great? Was there anyone saying, no, not really?
Thank you for that question. I'm not aware of any explicit knowledge on the part of Italian designers of the discussions happening in Germany. At least I haven't found anything explicitly referenced, especially in Domus, which is where these debate happen. But that would be an interesting thing to sort of look into. I think that the difference is that in Italy, the discussion on equipment and attrezzatura and portable housing actually happens connected to the Ethiopian invasion rather than connected with Eritrea, Somalia, or Libya. In those spaces, the desire was really to build permanent, big structures, not portable ones. So the discussion on colonial architecture is more on creating this linkage between vernacular Mediterranean architecture and Italian architecture in order to bolster the ideological need for Italy to invade Libya, for example, rather than on equipment itself. This is part of a larger project in which I want to really look at the tent, the Moretti tent, because Moretti was the producer of the most popular camping tents in Italy. The company closed in the 1970s, but those tents were used by hikers, but they were also used by people climbing mountains, and they continue to be used in Italy also in the post-war period by Boy Scouts. So there is really this history of this object that came from sports, then traveled very well to colonial projects, and then into the post-war period. But for example, the ads that I showed you, the more racist ads of the Moretti company, those come up after the invasion of Ethiopia. And for those of you who don't know Italian, literally in Italian, Moretto means small Moor. So there was also that play with the name of the company and the images on the ads.
In response to whether there was a counter exhibition to Wembley, no, not that I've ever heard of. Somebody who's online or in this room may be able to say differently, but I've never heard of any evidence of that. And I don't think that's surprising, because I think exhibitionary cultures in Britain were very parochial and actually perplexingly so to those who had sort of national interests in the way that Britain enacted its exhibition cultures until the 1930s, when they were sort of activated as sites of sort of communication and engagement by incoming designers from Eastern and Central Europe. People like Misha Black, who started to get very involved with helping to kind of change exhibitionary cultures and to see exhibitions as a much more kind of a form of political engagement. So in a way, in the mid-1920s, I'm not surprised that we wouldn't find that kind of exhibitions being used for that form or for that kind of reason. As a sort of footnote to what I said about Virginia Woolf being activated by Wembley, though, she continued to get very involved with politically engaged exhibitions after Wembley, when she'd written her essay. And so she got involved with supporting and fundraising for a whole series of peace exhibitions in the 1930s, for example, and as a way of counterbalancing and kind of giving the other side of some of these stories. So no is the straight answer, but in a way that isn't surprising given the particular moment, I think.
Thank you. I think there's a question from Noel, and then I have one for Noel as well. Do you want to would you like to ask your question in person?
I can. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So my question for you, Harriet, and I feel a bit awkward asking this because my presentation involved a lot of stale males, but one of the people I noticed in the presentation was Michael Joseph Savage, who was the Prime Minister of New Zealand at the time. I don't think he visited, but he was the head of the Labour Party that implemented social housing in New Zealand in the 1930s. So I was just wondering, did his participation have any impact in Glasgow? And I've said the Scottish / Glaswegian Labour, small L, and the Labour movement.
The short answer to that is I really don't know. I'm sorry. Other than knowing of his involvement on the panel and having looked at the pavilion, I don't know how his involvement played out. So I'm sorry, I can't say anything more on that.
Thank you. I actually think that we're already running a bit over time, so we have plenty of time for lunch, so it should be okay to ask a final question, which I will ask if that's okay. So to Noel, those intercolonial exhibitions, you've mentioned that now, but they seem sort of very white and male, and I wondered if there was any exception to that, or whether there was some sort of other representation as well.
Oh, definitely. Like, I guess I picked out the exhibition entrepreneurs, Joubert and Tapani, specifically because they tried to commercialize the process. But in terms of women's representation, Māori representation in New Zealand, it was actually quite strong, and probably, you know, Anne Calhoun in New Zealand's probably written the best history of arts and craft and women's representation in New Zealand, which in fact kind of shed quite another light on women's representation at exhibitions. But probably more importantly, I think the scientific aspect, which was really another group of, like another network. What I know from the design education was that a number of women became scientific illustrators and developed commercial careers, and also went on to teach in the design schools in New Zealand. So it was a way to develop like professional careers for design in a way in which that possibly wasn't available to men unless you're in a specific trade like architecture, printing, yeah, those ones in the 19th century. So yeah, I guess my emphasis on those is because I don't think they're well known anywhere other than New Zealand and Australia. So I'm kind of putting them out there as networks, and my interest is in how those intercolonial networks as a sub-network of international exhibitions actually facilitated a number of individuals to go on to do different things. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question. It's a good question though.
Thank you so much.